The Carole Lombard and Clark Gable house sits in Encino, Los Angeles, a sprawling mansion frozen in time. Nestled behind tall gates and surrounded by whispering trees, the house exudes an eerie stillness, as though its very walls hold their breath. Once a symbol of Hollywood glamour, it now draws attention for a much darker reason. It is said that Carole Lombard, who met a tragic end in a plane crash in 1942, never truly left the home she shared with her great love, Clark Gable. Locals call her presence the Lady in White. People who visited the house speak of icy drafts that creep through even in the blistering heat of California summers, faint traces of lavender perfume lingering in empty rooms, and a single shadow that seems to dart just out of sight. The story of the house begins like a fairy tale. In 1939, Clark and Carole purchased the property as a retreat from the chaos of Hollywood. Friends who visited said the house was filled with laughter, the kind of joy that seemed to defy the encroaching darkness of World War II. But after Lombard's untimely death, the laughter ceased, and the house became a monument to Gable's grief. Years after Gable sold the mansion, its new occupants reported unsettling phenomena. In the master bedroom, where Carole and Clark had spent their happiest days, the clock on the antique nightstand would stop at exactly 7:27 p.m., the reported time of Carole's plane crash. No amount of repair or replacement could fix it. The house earned its nickname, Frozen Time. One chilling incident stands out. In 1983, the Barkers, a family of 4, moved into the mansion, enchanted by its old Hollywood charm. On their first night, Beth Barker, the teenage daughter, claimed she saw a woman in a white gown standing at the end of the upstairs hallway. Thinking it was her mother, she called out, but the figure turned and walked straight into a wall, vanishing. Beth's parents dismissed it as a dream until they, too, began experiencing strange occurrences. Mr. Barker, a skeptic, refused to believe in ghosts. One evening, while repairing a broken light fixture in the kitchen, he heard the sound of faint humming. He looked up to find no one there. A moment later, every cabinet door in the room flung open with a deafening bang. He fled the house, leaving his tools behind. The most horrifying encounter happened during the family's final week in the mansion. Mrs. Barker woke one night to the sound of muffled sobbing. She followed the noise to the master bedroom, where she found the air so cold she could see her breath. On the bed sat a faint, translucent figure, Carole Lombard. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent cries. As Mrs. Barker froze in terror, the figure slowly raised its head, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and hollow, unblinking eyes. Then, it whispered, "He left me." The Barkers moved out the next morning. Today, the house stands mostly empty, a relic of a bygone era. Occasionally, a brave soul rents it, lured by its glamorous past. But they rarely stay long. Visitors claim the house feels alive, as though watching, waiting. Those who dare to enter at night often hear faint whispers, the words impossible to decipher but carrying a bone-deep sadness. Locals still report sightings of the Lady in White, forever wandering the home she once filled with life, searching for the happiness that was taken from her too soon. The house remains frozen in time, a chilling reminder that even the brightest stars cast the darkest shadows. One stormy evening, realtor Jacob Stein decided to stay late at the house to prepare it for an open house the next morning. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor, Jacob dismissed the local legends as mere folklore designed to scare off potential buyers. "A little history never hurt a sale," he muttered, sipping his coffee as thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm knocked out the power just past 9 p.m. Unbothered, Jacob used his phone's flashlight to navigate through the cavernous mansion. In the dim beam of light, the house seemed different, larger somehow, the shadows deeper, more alive. As he crossed the grand foyer, he thought he heard faint footsteps above him. He paused, calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" His voice echoed back, thin and hollow. The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting his lungs. Determined not to let his nerves get the better of him, Jacob climbed the staircase to investigate. At the top of the stairs, the long hallway stretched before him, its wallpaper peeling slightly from the edges. One of the doors at the far end was ajar, though Jacob distinctly remembered closing it earlier. He walked toward it, his steps slow and deliberate. The light from his phone flickered, as though its battery were draining unnaturally fast. When he reached the door, he hesitated. The room beyond was the master bedroom, and Jacob had heard enough tales to know what might be waiting for him. Still, he pushed the door open. The room was freezing, far colder than the rest of the house. Moonlight spilled through the large bay windows, illuminating the bed. On the nightstand, the antique clock ticked faintly, though it hadn't worked in decades. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he saw the hands slowly turning backward, ticking louder and louder until the sound became deafening. He covered his ears, but the noise seemed to reverberate inside his skull. Then it stopped. Silence. Jacob lowered his hands, his breath visible in the icy air. But the room wasn't empty. By the window stood a figure, her back to him. Her silhouette was unmistakable, the curve of her shoulder, the drape of her white gown. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly as though listening to something far away. "Ms. Lombard," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. The figure turned, but only partially, her face still obscured in shadow. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft but filled with an unbearable sorrow. Jacob stumbled back, knocking over a small table. The crash echoed through the house, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, she began to walk toward him, each step deliberate, her gown whispering against the floor. Panicked, Jacob turned to flee, but the door slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the house. He tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the soft humming began, the same tune the Barkers had heard decades earlier. "I don't belong here," Jacob gasped, pulling harder at the door. "You do now," the voice replied, closer this time. He whipped around to see the figure inches from him, her face finally visible in the pale light. It wasn't Carole Lombard's serene, tragic beauty that met his gaze. Instead, her features were twisted, her eyes black voids that seemed to pull the room into them. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, only darkness, endless and suffocating. Jacob screamed, the sound swallowed by the house. When the cleaning crew arrived the next morning, the house was empty, but Jacob's phone lay on the master bedroom floor, the flashlight still on. Its battery was completely drained, but the last photo in the gallery sent chills through everyone who saw it, a blurred image of a woman in white, her face a distorted smear of shadows and sorrow. No one could explain how the photo had been taken. And Jacob Stein? He was never seen again. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The police were quick to dismiss Jacob's disappearance as a tragic incident. A runaway, they assumed. A man who'd snapped, perhaps, overwhelmed by the eerie stories surrounding the house. But those who knew him better, those who had witnessed his growing unease in the weeks leading up to his final night in the mansion, weren't so convinced. Rachel, a close friend and fellow realtor, had always been skeptical of the ghost stories. But after hearing the chilling details of Jacob's last moments, something inside her shifted. She couldn't let it go. The phone's final image, the unnatural chill in the room, the way the house had seemed to swallow him whole, something was wrong. And it wasn't just the house. It was something far deeper, something tied to the very fabric of the place. Rachel decided to visit the house herself, hoping to get answers, to find any clue that could explain Jacob's sudden, inexplicable fate. The weather had cleared after the storm, leaving behind a crisp, eerie stillness. As she drove down the long, winding road toward the mansion, her headlights illuminated the looming figure of the house in the distance. It seemed to be waiting for her, its dark windows like eyes watching. She shook off the feeling of dread settling in her chest, telling herself it was just the stories getting to her. Rachel stood outside the gates, hesitating for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, she made her way up the long driveway. As she reached the front door, she noticed something strange. There was no "for sale" sign. The house had been vacant for years, yet it seemed as though someone had been keeping it in perfect condition, like it was waiting for someone to move in. The door creaked open of its own accord, as if inviting her in. Inside, the mansion was far colder than she expected. the air thick with an unsettling silence. The scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly floral filled her nose. As Rachel walked deeper into the house, she noticed something unusual. The floors, although old, had been swept clean, every corner free of debris. It was too well kept for a place that had been abandoned for decades. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as she made her way to the staircase. The same hallway Jacob had wandered down. The same door Jacob had opened. The same master bedroom. Her footsteps echoed louder in the empty space, the silence growing heavier with each step. As she approached the door, she swore she could hear something on the other side, a faint scratching noise, like nails running along wood. With trembling hands, Rachel opened the door. The room was as it had always been, bathed in soft moonlight from the window. But this time the air felt different. It wasn't just cold. It was suffocating. She could feel the presence of something or someone in the room with her. Her eyes scanned the space, but she saw nothing at first. Then, a soft whisper broke the silence. "Rachel!" Her heart stopped. She spun around, but the room was empty. "Rachel," the voice was clearer this time, as though it was coming from behind her, but no one was there. Her hands gripped the doorframe for support, and the temperature dropped even further. She could see her breath now, clouding in the air. The whispering continued, growing louder, more frantic. It was unmistakable now. It wasn't just a voice. It was a plea. "Help me, please." Rachel's pulse quickened. She turned toward the window and froze. The clock on the nightstand was ticking again, its hands moving backward, just as Jacob had described. She stepped closer to it, unable to look away from the steadily moving hands. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. In the deafening silence that followed, Rachel felt a presence beside her. She turned slowly, a lump in her throat, and saw the figure standing just beyond the door, partially obscured by shadows. The woman was dressed in a flowing white gown. Her hair, dark and disheveled, framed a face Rachel could barely make out. The woman took a step forward, her movements fluid, unnatural, almost as if she were floating. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She knew who this was, Carole Lombard, but her face was twisted in anguish, her eyes dark, hollow, and filled with sorrow that went far beyond death. You should have never come," Carole whispered, her voice no longer soft but filled with a bitter, chilling edge. "I didn't want this, but now you know." The walls around Rachel seemed to close in, the room spinning, the shadows pressing closer, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. "Get out," Carole hissed, stepping closer, her form flickering in and out like a fading image on a broken film reel. "Before it takes you, too." Rachel tried to scream, but the air was thick, stifling. Her legs refused to move as she felt herself being pulled toward the figure. The sound of the clock ticking grew louder, the room seemed to pulse, and the air around her thickened until it felt as though she were drowning. Then, everything went dark. The next morning, Rachel's car was found at the foot of the driveway, the door wide open, her purse lying in the passenger seat. But Rachel was gone just like Jacob. The house stood silent, the clock still ticking backward, its hands frozen at 7:27. And now, rumors whispered through Encino once again, the house was calling. But no one dared to go near it. No one except those drawn in by its terrible, haunting beauty. The mansion waited, and in its silence, time moved backward, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter, to learn the truth. But the truth, as they say, is a dangerous thing. And some things once seen can never be unseen. The house on Encino's quiet street stood as an enigmatic monument to a past that refused to die. Though it had remained empty for years, rumors surrounding the mansion never seemed to fade. And with each passing month, the stories of those who dared to enter grew darker, more twisted. After Rachel's disappearance, a new, unspoken agreement settled over the town. No one went near the house. Yet, as time wore on, some still found themselves drawn to its desolate beauty. It was a foggy Thursday morning when Detective Emily Hayes, new to the area, heard whispers about the mansion. An outsider, she had come to Encino to escape the city's chaos and start fresh. but she quickly became intrigued by the house. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, eyes darting away whenever she asked questions. Emily's curiosity, however, was not so easily stifled. Having grown up in the city, she knew better than to fall for ghost stories. Still, there was something unsettling about the place, a chill that clung to it like a second skin. When Emily finally visited the mansion, her instincts screamed that it was something far more sinister than just a haunted house. It was the morning after a storm when she parked her car near the gates. The house loomed ahead, its stone walls weathered and worn, its windows dark eyes that seemed to follow her every move. She could hear the wind whispering through the trees, but there was no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade as she approached. The door opened easily, as though expecting her. Inside, the mansion was eerily pristine, as if time had stopped the moment the last resident had left. Dust hung in the air, caught in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows. The silence was suffocating. Emily walked through the large foyer, feeling the weight of the place pressing on her chest. She was no stranger to crime scenes, but this felt different, darker, heavier. As she passed through the rooms, she felt an unsettling pull toward the staircase, as if something was beckoning her upward. She hesitated at first, but curiosity overcame her. The hallway at the top of the stairs seemed to stretch on forever. And then she saw it. At the end of the hall was the master bedroom, the door slightly ajar. The very same room Rachel had entered, the same room where Jacob's disappearance had been linked. Emily's breath caught in her throat, but she couldn't stop herself from walking toward it. The door creaked open as she pushed it, revealing the room beyond. It was as if the air had changed the moment she crossed the threshold. Felt colder, oppressive. The bed was made, the windows shut tight, but there was a lingering scent in the air, lavender, faint but unmistakable. It was the same scent that had been described in countless reports of strange occurrences in the house. She stepped further into the room, her eyes scanning the space. There, on the nightstand, the clock was ticking again, its hands moving backwards, just like they had for Jacob and Rachel. "Why is this happening?" Emily whispered, her mind racing. She had seen 100 cases like this, haunted locations, strange disappearances, eerie coincidences, but something about this house felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. A soft rustling sound came from behind her. Emily spun around, her heart racing. There was no one there. Then, as she took another step toward the window, the temperature dropped, and she saw something moved in the corner of her eye. She froze. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. The woman was dressed in a white gown, her long hair flowing behind her like a dark river. Her face was gaunt, the hollow eyes staring directly at Emily. She stepped forward, but Emily's feet refused to move. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness of the room. It was Carole Lombard. But this time, her face was different, her features twisted, drained of any beauty or recognition. Her skin was pale and cracked, as if the years had ravaged her long after her death. She looked wrong, not quite human. "I was never meant to be forgotten," Carole said, her voice trembling with a sorrow so deep it seemed to ripple through the room. "But they took me, they took everything." Emily's pulse quickened, but she stood rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force held her in place. The clock on the nightstand ticked faster now, as though time itself was unraveling. "Who took you?" Emily managed to whisper, her voice trembling. Carole's mouth twitched, and for a moment, her expression softened. "The house," she whispered, a faraway look in her eyes. "The house remembers, and it doesn't forget." The walls seemed to groan, and the air grew thick, charged with a malevolent energy. Emily took a step back, her breath shallow. She could feel the house closing in on her, its walls pulsing with an unseen force, like the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Emily spun around, panic rising in her chest. She rushed to the window, but it was sealed shut, as if it had never been open in the first place. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and a voice, low, guttural, whispered from the walls. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Emily's heart raced. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. As she pulled it from her pocket, a new message appeared on the screen. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "You have 1 hour." Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet shifted. She fell to her knees as the entire room seemed to tilt, the walls bending inward like the house was slowly folding itself in on her. The air grew thick with an unbearable pressure, as though the weight of 1,000 years was bearing down on her. And then, as quickly as it had started, the house fell silent. But Emily wasn't alone. There, in the corner of the room, Carole Lombard stood, watching with eyes that were no longer just filled with sorrow, they were filled with rage. "I've been waiting," she whispered, her voice a chilling promise. "Now you're mine." The door slammed open behind Emily, and before she could escape, the room seemed to shift again. Emily screamed, but it was swallowed by the house as it swallowed her whole. Days later, the mansion stood still once more, its dark windows reflecting only the overcast sky. Detective Emily Hayes, like those before her, had disappeared without a trace. The authorities dismissed it as another mysterious case, but the townspeople knew better. The mansion was alive, its dark history woven into the very walls. Carole Lombard, her sorrow and rage now entwined with the house, had claimed yet another soul. The clock on the nightstand continued to tick backward, as it always had, as it always would, pulling anyone who dared to enter into its timeless curse. The mansion was waiting, as it had for decades, for the next soul brave or foolish enough to cross its threshold. And with each new disappearance, the legend of Carole Lombard's haunted house grew, its dark grip tightening on Encino. Some things, after all, are never meant to be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.